Norway. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Dr. Thiessen. What is your opinion and thoughts on the fact that Europe won't be at the negotiating table in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, when U.S. and Russian officials speak?
Well, I think it makes sense for the Americans and the Russians because they really want to make a deal. And the key demands of the Russians is that there will be no NATO expansionism to Ukraine, and also there has to be acceptance for the territorial concessions. The United States recognize that this is just reality, and every day they wait with such a peace agreements will only be a worse and worse deal. The problem is that the Europeans, they seem to have very unrealistic demands. They're still talking about NATO membership. Also, they didn't do any diplomacy for the past 3 years. They put a full boycott on any diplomacy and negotiations. And they still express very open hostility to the idea of negotiations, instead suggest just sending more weapons. So it's feared by both the Americans and the Russians that the Europeans would likely be spoilers. They would just seek to undermine the negotiations. So I think both Moscow and Washington has reached a conclusion that it's better just to cut out the Europeans, because Europe has also become less and less relevant over the past, especially the past 3 years. So there's not really that much need to have them there, I think, is the main thoughts coming from, again, both Washington now and Moscow.
Europeans are very keen on having these gatherings in Europe, the Munich Security Conference, and now they're migrating to Paris for talks. Where does Europe stand at this point? What should it do?
Well, this is a very bad place where they're standing. At this point, they're not allowed to join the negotiations, but they can't even host the negotiations because we don't have neutral states in Europe anymore. Traditionally, they would meet in Helsinki, Geneva. This is no longer the possibility. I think it's important for Europe to recognize where its irrelevance comes from. And indeed, when it was decided to redivide the continent after the Cold War, and hence starting the Cold War by expanding NATO, I think there was very obvious from then on that conflicts would unavoidably start with Russia. And we've been moving towards this since the 90s. And when you have conflicts, the logic of a military alliance is that the Europeans will become more dependent on the United States, and the US can then translate this security dependence into loyalty, both economic and political loyalties. So we now seen over the past few years that the Americans can demand that the Europeans cut them off from other economic centers of power, be it Russia and China, which is important for Europe's development. It can even destroy the European energy infrastructure, cannibalize European industries, and even threaten to take European territory, as we see now with Greenland, without the Europeans being able to do anything. So Europe's becoming more dependent, deindustrialized, it's in economic decline, its geopolitical relevance diminished. So what it needs to do is first end this military dividing lines in Europe, bring this to an end, and very basic security. If you want other countries to recognize your security interest, you have to recognize theirs as well. And then, of course, they should revive the benefits of actually having the EU. That is, they should digitalize their industries. They should use some collective bargaining power. But at the moment, I think the EU has become a big burden for Europe, given this very strong ideological stance it has on key issues.
And my final question is, ideologically, with elections in so many European capitals on the way, do you think that the people of Europe are a bit frustrated as well with these policies? And do you see a more tilt to the right?
No, I think definitely. And you just played that video of the Munich Security Council chairman breaking out in tears, which was, I think, it symbolized very much how this Munich Security Conference went. And this is what happens in Europe, where the main where the countries aren't actually standing up for their basic national interest. Indeed, no one ever explained why this was in the interest for Europe to do. We already knew that this whole war could have been avoided if we just accepted some basic security interests for Russia, that is not expand the hostile military bloc to its borders. But instead, we have now political leaders who still want to continue a war, even though the Ukrainian population doesn't want the war, can fight against the world's largest nuclear power, a war that can't be won and which we have already lost. And they want to continue to double down, even though this is devastating the European economies. Europe is deindustrializing. So at some point, I think you're going to see now in the months and years to come, there will be more elections, and a lot of the old political class, which has committed themselves completely to this ideology of liberal hegemony, in which they refuse to recognize any legitimate Russian security concerns, and the economy is always it isn't prioritized above the ideological commitments. I think they will see themselves losing more and more support from the public, and when a country doesn't pursue its national interest, you will see a vacuum emerge. And this vacuum is now being filled by forces, political groups, both on the left and the right, who doesn't have the same ideas about what Europe should be. So I think new powers are coming into play, and I think it's very necessary for Europe, because we have a whole political class who's been ideologically wedded to the idea of liberal hegemony, and they can't really seem to decouple from it. So the big changes has to come, and I think we need a new political class for it.
Dr. Glenn Diesen, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation. Nothing like a healthy dose of realism on a Monday morning. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Thank you.
Likewise.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.